Book 5, Chapter 1. This is YouTube lesson for Book 5, Chapter 1 on Calvinism. And we are going to begin to study Calvinism from Chapter 1.
In replacement theology, the fulfillment of the millennial was no longer to be achieved by the remnant of the Jews and Christ the Messiah reigning together, but it was replaced and was to be fulfilled in a Catholic utopia of the church federal aspect of covenant theology. In replacement theology, all that was promised to the Jews now belonged to the church. See Appendix C on replacement theology. It was then in the 4th century when this misconception was introduced that the secular theological image of those passages which were affected begin to be inaccurately seen as being pertaining to the personal unconditional eternal security of individual New Testament saints, i.e. St. John 10, St. John 6, Romans 9, and others. From the very beginning of Christianity up to Augustine, there was no image of an elect. That misconception did not exist in the mind of the church world. The imagery of the elect is purely Augustinian, not apostolic. Because of the imagery of the elect that was in replacement theology, on which Augustine based his theory and perception of those passages mentioned, ever since the 4th century, these passages have been incorrectly referred to in the light of them discussing the personal sainthood of New Testament believers. And because that idea was passed down, these passages have become identified with the unconditional eternal security doctrine. The erroneous image of these originally messianic related passages being taught as New Testament soteriology has been reiterated over and over again by both Catholic and Protestant theologians, erroneously so down through the centuries. Calvin and the Reformers inherited the idea of the elect and passed it down through the years. Calvin's theology is dominated by the imagery of Augustine's secret elect, which is taught from the misinterpretation of these texts, St. John 6, 10, Romans 9:11. Calvin and the Reformers put it on in thick layers by reiterating it. It was the theology of the Reformation. It was written in Calvin's Institute, confirmed at the Council of Dort, installed in the Westminster Confessions in the Creed of the Presbyterian Church. Through the layers of this image being spread in philosophical theology that has deceitfully made these passages appear as full-mentioned passages on the subject of the personal unconditional eternal security of individual New Testament believers. In short, this is how these passages became to be used out of context to erroneously teach the perseverance of the saints, that is the once saved always saved doctrine. This imagery was passed down to generations of Reformed theologians, with there being no discrimination for validity's sake in those receiving this image. This is why it is often heard or read in Reformed theologians' commentaries and sermons the term the elect. It is the unscriptural image which was placed there by Augustinianism, not Jesus or the apostles. This term should never be heard of coming from a minister who is truly apostolic. Based on this, we are not Reformed theologians, we are apostolic in doctrine. The Esau and Jacob story, hijacked by Reformed theologians. By Augustine's claiming that the story of Esau and Jacob was a federal account covenant theology of how individual men are elected to eternal salvation or damnation, he hid the true message about the lineage of the Jews coming in Jacob to Israel, to Joseph, and Mary, to Jesus, which was the real point. This very significant point, which was not related to anyone going to hell or heaven, was hid in the false teaching on the election of individuals to heaven or hell. Mistaught from this passage. Covenant theology licensed it, because it changed the view of scriptures from seeing God's plan in the Jews when the passages were pertaining to them, to canceling that out and forcing all passages to be about the three covenants. Covenant theology with attention on man in general and avoiding any focus on the Jews. This is where the philosophical imagery of the secret elect, which is eternally saved, comes from. There is no other source known to us from which this doctrine came and imagery was drawn. He who comes to me, I will in no wise cast out. Also, in the context of St. John 6:37, where Jesus is speaking specifically to the band of Jews who were cast out of the synagogue for their connection and confession of him, Augustine and Calvin misused this passage to be referring to New Testament saints not being lost. I will not cast him out. Jesus was not referring to a secret elect group that will not be lost, cast out, but rather those Jews who followed him under a then current threat of being cast out of Jewish society. One of the greatest fears of the Jews then was that of being cast out by the supposed authorities of that day, the Pharisees. Jesus says to that fear and anxiety, hence being cast out, that he would not do them, the Jews, like they have been done by the Pharisees, who would cast them out of the synagogue. This is the exact context of St. John 6:37, not the eternal security of New Testament saints, such that he is teaching once saved, always saved. No. That is not the background of this passage. This is also what he was speaking to in St. John 10:26-29. If they came to him fleeing, those false shepherds, the Pharisees that ruled the synagogue, because they didn't rule Jesus, the real shepherd, they will not be able to against the sheep's will, and Jesus will pluck them out from Jesus, the real shepherd. This is the precise context. This is not teaching the unconditional eternal security of New Testament saints' covenant theology construal. Conclusion: in this chapter we have discussed as briefly as we could, in these few pages, how the doctrine of unconditional eternal security was formed. We have exposed its roots. We have shown that it did not start with Jesus. Nor did the apostles teach it or even know about it when they died off. It is composed of Gnosticism and the anti-Semitism that called for replacement and covenant theology. We exposed the dangerous yet common perspective of the scriptures, where covenant theology overrode the context of passages like John 10, John 6, Romans 9:11, and others, misusing them to create a picture of an elect group which is once saved and can never be lost, and who have unconditional eternal security. They so-called theologians forced these passages out of context to teach their doctrine that is foreign to what Jesus, the apostles, and the apostolic fathers taught. We have shown by pointing out the misconceptions of replacement theology that this errored view is not biblical, but is merely the philosophical construal of the secular religious world of Reformed theology, Calvinism.